projects. It's a long way of saying it's a commission to study the utility of public-private partnerships in Rhode Island and determine whether we need any legislative supplements or perhaps comprehensive legislation to make these types of projects more feasible in our state. I'd like to call our meeting to order and ask that we call the roll as our first order of business.
Chairman Coffey?
Here.
Tim Scanlon? Here. Gary Izovsky? Here. John Simmons? Here. Richard Bernardo? Here. And Michael McNally? Here. And Daniel Egan. We do have a quorum.
Thank you very much. In any event, if those of you who've seen the notice that was posted with respect to this meeting know that we are going to provide this afternoon through a number of speakers who have been kind enough to attend, some from great distances, an overview and presentations regarding public-private partnerships, the experience within the industry that provides public-private partnerships, including a company that's been very much involved in actually performing public-private partnership work. We have a total of 5 speakers representing 3 different organizations. I've asked the speakers to try to limit their presentations. Nonetheless, our meeting is scheduled to run from 3 until 5 p.m. Our hope is that we'll have some opportunity at the end, well before 5 p.m., to provide some additional time for discussion that'll include the commission members themselves, and also I'll provide some time for public comment. I'd invite the members of the commission to ask questions, preferably at the end of a presentation, although I don't discourage you if it's something that's really burning from interrupting the presentation and focusing on one particular issue that might catch your interest or you might have a question about. But again, we'll go through these in groups, starting with, let me introduce first of all John Smolen. John is a partner at Nossaman, and he's speaking here today on behalf of the National Council for Public-Private Partnerships, of which he serves on their board of directors. If you don't mind, I'll introduce you each in turn prior to your beginning of your statements. John, I've gotten to know recently. We have had some experience at my firm, Burns & Levinson, with him over the years. Firm Nossaman does a good deal of work, not only regionally but throughout the country with respect to representation of communities and sometimes private participants in public-private partnerships. He's very knowledgeable. I've heard his presentation previously. I think it'll be of interest to you. Again, our goal today is to learn as much broadly as we can about public-private partnerships so we understand how they do and can work based on the experience of these individuals and in other states and jurisdictions. So without further ado, John, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Coffey. Thank you, members of the Commission, for taking the time to hear from us here today about P3s and more generally about how to think about innovative delivery. I have the distinct honor of sitting with some extremely notorious and well-regarded gentlemen to my right who I think, as a general proposition, represent every facet of the P3 and the innovative financing community that would be relevant to you today, if not the most relevant persons to give and answer the questions that you may have. I have the fairly happy task, reasonably easy task, as it were, to set the table with some definitions, some terms, concepts, and general thoughts. There will be some revisiting of some of those general themes through these gentlemen's presentations, which is intended to convey at the same time their importance and the consensus across this group about these things, but also they'll have an opportunity to use them as a springboard to get into some more in-depth perspective on that from their perspectives and, frankly, from the perspectives that they know of everyone else who plays in a P3 scenario. I had the opportunity to pass along some slides in advance, and we are looking at slides here. I'm not sure if you have them in front of you. I'll walk you through them, and I assure you, Mr. Coffey, there will be time, at least on my presentation, for you to ask any questions. So the second slide would take you to what is a P3. There's a lot of debate historically about a P3. Some people think that a P3 is any relationship between a public entity and a private entity, but we're talking in a more technical sense here of a public-private partnership really fundamentally grounded in contract. And it's where a public entity, through an enabling statute, ordinance, or otherwise, is empowered to enter into an arrangement with a private sector for participation and financing of a public project. So you take any interaction between government people and then you push it together and say this is a contract and it's a contract about projects. There are any number of kinds of projects, there are any number of kinds of contracts, but fundamentally, and this would be the NCCCC's view on what a P3 is, that's what I'm going to be orienting you to when we talk about P3s. As it has evolved here in the States, largely from lessons we've learned from our colleagues over in the UK and Australia and otherwise, there is really a honing in on thinking about the delivery of the project less in terms of complying with the specification and more in terms of delivering a performance. In other settings, I'm fond of suggesting the differences between describing exactly the chocolate chip cookie that I'm expecting you to bake and instead saying, I want a cookie that people will buy and eat. And that's the distinction that we're going through here that could be applied philosophically through what project would find itself percolating up for consideration as a P3. So on the next slide, it's intended to show you essentially a spectrum based upon that understanding of what a public-private partnership is conceptually. It is, in a way, in between two extremes. On one extreme is a traditional government procurement. Generally speaking, the government entity hires someone to design this thing right down to, what kind of knobs go on the dresser. That incurs a cost. And then you go to the lowest bidder on a competitive procurement for someone to build this exact thing. On the other side of the spectrum is a privatization, which is taking a public good and effectively selling it to the private sector and removing your responsibility for it. A public-private partnership, as I'm presenting here, and I believe as we're going to be presenting as a group, is neither of those things. It is, in fact, a little bit of, we're going to design enough to know that we want cookies rather than pound cake. And there's going to be an involvement of the private sector, but they're not going to own it. What they're going to own is the delivery of the performance that you are requiring of them. So if there's a political point to make, and it's often confused, public-private partnerships isn't a fancy long word for privatization. It simply is not. Privatization is a completely different legal undertaking for the reasons that I stated. On the next slide, you will notice that these are sectors where P3s, particularly in the States, but generally speaking across the globe, have touched. I've tried to organize this in ways that you can see that it covers public projects, transportation, water, sewer, energy, public facilities. If you were, those are the golf balls in the middle of the fairway. But it's anything that is made into a project that can be benefited by the innovations that are available by the private sector. I have been a part of conversations where they've talked about public-private partnerships to take over parks and the use of facilities within parks to invite more participation in the park. That was new. That's in my little second bullet point underneath because I haven't seen one yet, but it underscores the point that it is a possible way to do it. Then you would say, of these sectors, there are ones that generate revenue, and then there are ones that either don't generate enough revenue or don't generate revenue. And there are P3 strategies to help deliver those projects in those ways. A revenue-generating project, for example, would be a bridge with a toll on it. You would project finance, essentially, the aggregate tolls to fund the building of the bridge, but in a P3 context, it would be that the toll revenue would be available to fund the project measured on the performance of people, not necessarily the people going over the bridge. In other words, people would want to go over the bridge, which would generate more toll revenue because of the things that the private sector hypothetically could bring to the bridge. A social asset would be a school or a courthouse. There's precedent for courthouses. You don't pay a fee to walk into a courthouse but it's a public good. But there are efficiencies to be gained on how it is that a courthouse and a jail system or any of these other public services could be consolidated into one place and avoid costs, transportation from one facility to another, avoid any number of other costs. Those are not revenues. Those are avoided costs that become essentially a revenue source to deliver that project. My next slide is to show you now that we've shown you the polls and we've showed you who can do it, and if I'm going too fast, just throw your hands up in the air. It's okay. You can go in varying degrees of the involvement of and effectively the tapping into the participation of the private sector in the delivery of the public good. Think of it as wading into a zero-depth swimming pool. You can start by abdicating, as it were, a little bit of the design responsibility to the private sector to say, I really want to build a swimming pool. I know that I want it to be wet and it can't be bigger than this. So rather than telling them the dimensions, you say, I want a swimming pool that fits in this space. You have effectively shifted the design responsibility and several of the design risks to the private sector, and they can bring in a builder, and you have a design-build project. But when it's done, they throw you the keys, it's yours. As you move down, there are further opportunities to engage the private sector to deliver other functions that are government functions. Who's going to run the swimming pool after you build it? Well, you might have a contract that allows them to build it in such a way to manage anticipated operations and maintenance costs, and that would be your DBOM, your design, build, operate, maintain. I'll pause here before I go too far to say this is the alphabet soup we're going to be dealing with today, and I'm in many ways looking for your permission to say DBFOM, DBOM, design, build. These are the words that this group operates in, but at no point should you feel bad about asking us what we mean again. Now we shift to the right, and probably if you will, a bit of a salinity change in the P3 is the involvement in the delegation of the responsibility to finance the project. There are P3s, strategies, that delegate the responsibility of financing the project to the private party. There are ways that public sector folks are used to doing it. You raise bonds, you have your appropriations, you have your 6-year plan about how you're going to schedule things out. That is all relevant, but at the same time, it might be that the money's not available now, or it's not going to be available at the amounts that we need now, and you can turn to the private sector and ask them to come up with a way to finance this. A design-build finance is essentially a build it and then pay back over a period of time. Mr. Ayala at the end of the table, he's one of the experts in the country, if not the world, on how to think creatively about financing. And if his presentation lends itself to it, I invite him to spend a few minutes on what he thinks about when he thinks about delegation of financing. The varsity one, as it were, is the DBFOM, which is, I know what I want. I know that we have some source of money. I know that you can think of a better way to deliver it. I need you to think about this on a long-term concession. Design, build, finance, operate, and maintain now takes from building an asset to thinking about an asset for a life cycle. That swimming pool is going to need repairs. It's going to need to be recaulked. It's going to need to recognize that after 3 to 5 years, your lifeguards are going to go off to college and you're going to need to hire new lifeguards. You can take that and hand it to a private sector concessionaire and say, think about how to do this for 30 to 50 years. Come back to me. We work out what those costs are. They program their expenses. We work out a way to pay them for that over the period of time. And you have now delivered a performance-based project with a lifespan with someone else accountable to deliver it because their money's on the line and their repayments are on the line, which is where I'm going to open up by saying, here's the eye chart of all of the ones that you're going to get in your package today. I've seen my colleagues' presentations. They're far more aesthetically pleasing, but I'm afraid that's all I could do was to get everything I wanted to tell you guys about DBFOMs into 3 slides. So bear with me. This shows you that there's a public agency owner looking to one private partner concessionaire, and everything flows through the private party concessionaire. Colloquially, you might say there's one neck to choke. In my military background, I would say, I know who the commander of the deal is, and I'm going to go to them. And I'm going to say, the trash hasn't been taken out. Why is the roof falling in? How come there's only 2 people manning this thing? You don't have to seek people out going like this. You get to find one person and say, this is what our deal was. You're not delivering. Or this is what our deal was and you are delivering. Good job. So if you'll notice that, that's the key value, in my opinion, that you get from going on to a P3 is the one single point of contact to do this. Okay. Now, when you go to a longer-term P3 arrangement where all of this life cycle consideration, financing obligations are taken into account, you have to rethink what a good project looks like. So when you think about how long to make this concession, you're looking at life cycles, you're having conversations with these bidding concessionaires, and you're thinking rapidly in your brain, this isn't about the lowest bid necessarily. This is about what delivers the best value to us as a public sector entity. Any number of ways to illustrate this, but imagine if somebody said, I want the swimming pool to last for 30 years, you're probably going to spend a little more for concrete. Because the concrete needs to be able to last for a span of time where when it breaks down, I'm replacing it fewer times, so in the aggregate there's less cost. But in the short run, there's more expensive concrete. Now add that up for absolutely every single aspect of how this project comes together, and you find yourself in a partnership discussion. So I have as the notion best value, but there's a lot packed into best value, and I think that the hallmark of that best value is you're thinking about this as partners with your private sector partners. So your private sector partners are bringing their ideas. There's mechanisms in the procurement process to do that. But more importantly, you're not speaking behind a veiled wall, all looking at the bottom line. You're thinking about what this thing is supposed to do and how long we can do it, where it makes the most sense for our taxpayers. If I can get to the next slide, sir. So this is the second eye-level eye chart, and in case you didn't hear me the first time, I'm apologizing at the top. This is essentially the rough sketch of how you get to a design, build, finance, operate, and maintain. This is mostly so after all of this flood of information you get from you folks, when you go back to your office and you're trying to recount what it is that we talked about today, come to this slide and say, here's all of the things that everybody talked about how you get from the concept of a P3 to a P3. The only thing that I will talk about is the drivers here are our ability to deliver this project, the public's ability to drive the project with an identified revenue stream to solve this project financing that's over a longer span of time than you're used to do. And it is about an efficient allocation of risk between the public sector and the private sector to deliver the best value. Now, I'm a lawyer. That sounds like what a lawyer would say. Proper risk allocation between the public and the private sector to deliver best value. Doesn't sound like there's a lot of content in there, and that's where coming attractions, you're going to get some from these gentlemen to my right, and I'm actually going to pop in on a few things myself. There are risks in a 2-year project. There are risks in a traditional design, bid, build procurement, and then there are risks in a 50-year concession procurement that aren't in either of those first two. Just as an example, what happens if the law changes? That's not something that you think about when you're thinking on a 2-year horizon. What happens if the insurance markets go sideways? What do we do about the up and down on the prices of insurance? There's a lot of risks to consider, and in the consideration up front, you find an efficiency that makes the project viable. So, if there's a highlighter in your hand, the bottom of the screen is what I would want you to do. Think about revenue stream, risk appetite, and then all of the rest falls into place about who's going to participate in the P3 discussion. So how do you participate? And that's the next slide, John. Oh, sorry, I'm sorry, the next slide, my bust. Okay, how do you get started? Well, if you're sold even a little bit on this being something worthwhile, you have to put a framework in place to think about how to engage the private sector, how to figure out if you have projects that lend themselves to P3 consideration, and whether or not those projects are viable as P3s. So my firm, as was alluded to by Mr. Coffey, as a general proposition represents public sector entities who are trying to figure this out. That's what we do. I hope that no one has tried to shoot me yet, so I'm thinking we're doing okay in the market. So you have to figure out how to walk before you can run into P3s. There are matured, there are maturing, and there are novice public sector entities here in the United States thinking about how to solve infrastructure problems that are of a large scale to engage private sector thoughts and, frankly, to engage private sector financing innovation. All of them that succeeded did this. And it starts by thinking about what are we going to allow ourselves as a government, stewards of the government's, the people's money, stewards of the budgeting process, and stewards of how it is that we're going to rack and stack our projects. How are we going to put those P3 procedures into place? It starts with a law. It starts with a law that I'm sure everyone at this table has very good developed thoughts on what works and what does not work. And I'm happy, of course, to share with you at any time some of my more particular thoughts. But I can tell you that the enabling legislation should reflect the market. If you have the right law, then you will attract the people who know how to do P3s and large-scale deals and solve complicated financing challenges because they know that you're mindful of how the market has responded to that. The second point I will make is that it's transparent. There is no behind the secret door, I know this guy, we all mean this by this word kind of deal. It is, this is what these words mean in the market. People understand how the process works. They know that you're going to follow the process because the law is crystal clear about how it goes about doing it. The third one is that there is reference in your enabling statute to processes, procedures, and implementing regulations that have worked. There's any number of examples of that that are in the market. Any number of our states here in the Union that have stumbled, tripped, fixed, and done better. And then you, hypothetically, can benefit from those lessons learned right out of the gates. And I can tell you that all of your P3 market participants are going to be watching for those things so that they don't have to rehearse with you why it didn't work in state X. Okay, the next step, I'm going to go back one more. I just want to make a couple more points on this if I could, is that when you get to the point where we're talking about P3s in Rhode Island, it can't be an abstract thing where a bunch of folks in suits and ties, is there ability? Yeah. A bunch of suits and ties were talking about best value and risk allocation and efficiency. There has to be someone who's willing to stand up and say, here's how it works, come ask me questions. Every successful P3 program in the country, for that matter in the world, has someone who's championed it to get it moving. And I think that you may hear that theme a couple times here, that it's more than just the legislation, it's someone fending off people who don't understand the P3. I'm going to pause here to say a P3 is a tool in the toolbox. One more metaphor for you. It isn't the answer for everything. And indeed, there are any number of projects that should not be done as public-private partnerships. Just shouldn't be. If you have set up a legislation that vets those out and implementing regulations with a champion who knows how to call balls and strikes, you're going to get to a point where it makes sense. But then your next challenge is explaining to people why it's not like what they're used to seeing. You need someone to reach out and touch in those situations. I'm a lawyer advisor. I can load a lot of guns for those discussions, but there needs to be someone's guns to load. I think the most successful P3 programs in the country have an internal champion. The third point that I will hit on this right here is, starting from the third bullet point down, is how do you start after you have a law that lets you go, someone waving the flag, frankly, advisors on board that can tell you how to avoid the pitfalls? How do you get from what are we doing to I have a pipeline of projects that are intelligent, that are going to be managed, that are responsive to the market? It starts with regulations, which Law School 101, that's just another version of a good law. Same lessons apply. Then it becomes a program. Then it becomes trusted advisors who know what they're talking about. And then it becomes building a project pipeline. A pipeline can be a pipeline of one. It can be. So you don't need to think that if you walk down the primrose path of P3s, you need to have 23 things to get people's attention. But I can tell you right now, developing a program for a project is going to make people wary. There's a relationship, there's a partnership responsibility, there's a partnership commitment that you're going to get by engaging the outside. And I leave you at that. So now I'm going to give you a couple high points. I think I'm doing a little bit okay. I got 5 minutes left. I can do this. Most of what I have to say here are the pencil sketch, high-level bullet points, Roman numerals, and an outline of what you're supposed to do. We can go to the next slide, John. How do you identify a P3 program? You start with a lot of navel gazing. You do what you're doing here today, which is thinking about this delivery process, and then the things are working in the back of your head. John said performance-based. John said scale to engage with the market. Okay, well, what do we got here in Rhode Island? What are we trying to do here? That was the only thing that I learned in graduate school that I remember. I will just tell you. It was my professor saying to me, what are we trying to do here? That is actually the most fundamental step when you walk down this road is, what are our objectives? Do we have projects that are getting out of control in costs? Do we have an unmet need but not necessarily a problem with revenue? Do we really need this project now and we just don't have the revenue now but we'll have the revenue later? These are all drivers to get you from objectives through a thinking of the project into which of those spectrum that we talked about in a P3 context makes the most sense. It is not a paint by numbers. You're going to need some folks to help walk you through that. But I can't tell you what your objectives are. I can ask you a lot of questions till you determine what your objectives are, and then I can say, oh, based on those objectives, we need to be thinking about these things, and we don't need to be thinking about these things. So the next step, if I may, hypothetically, we've gone through this, we've come with a fantastic idea, we have a bullpen of projects that we're excited about. Now, how do you value capture what the P3 delivers? Risk shifting is the purpose of a P3. Risk shifting. Back to my cookie example. If nobody buys the chocolate chip cookie that's 3 inches in diameter with 63 chips in it, that's your problem. But if you say, I want you to make cookies that people buy, and then people don't buy them, that's the private sector's problem, right? That is a shifting of risk. Sometimes when you shift a risk, and my ears are going to be burning, I'm thinking when I'm looking at a lot of red faces over here, sometimes when you shift a risk, the private sector will be happy to take it, and they are going to price it. And then all of the value that you're seeking to capture in a public-private partnership goes away on this principle that you're doing a great job of shifting risk to the private sector. The minute in your brain a little gotcha tone starts floating around, you're dead. Okay? There are things that you're going to retain. But then there are things that you're going to shift to a private sector partner who's willing to do it because they're going to be in a great position to manage that risk. And if they're in an ability to manage that risk in a situation where they're in a competition with other people trying to get that project or to establish that partnership relationship, you're going to get value for money. Lots of buzzwords, that's it. Next slide, if I may. This is only to say, philosophically, when you get into those discussions, this is in my experience what you got to go from the first 2 bullet points down to the 4th bullet point. Everybody's used to design, bid, build. Everybody's used to, here are the people that we engage. Everybody's used to their standard terms and conditions. But when you think of things afresh, you step away and realize there are some risks that properly sit with us. And then there are risks that we've historically taken that maybe we can shift to someone else. I will be corrected by the gentleman at this table. The private sector wants to know that they're going to get paid, that they're going to be able to quantify their risks, and that you're going to be playing by the rules. Then you get into a P3 procurement, and that's where the partnership is built. Risks are priceable. Payment streams reliable. It's not necessarily certain. We all understand how the appropriations process works. Partnership. If we get to that, you're in the vicinity of getting to close on a deal. And it's actually a wonderful thing when you can see it. All right. I'm actually going to, I think I have overstepped my time, Mr. Coffey, so I will say there is 2 slides from here, there's a thing that says things that I'm not addressing here. And the reason that I'm not addressing them is because these folks are in a really great position to talk about these things. What are they thinking about with financing? What is the role of the federal government sometimes in our procurements that we would want to put forth as the public sector? What are some P3 agreement provisions that you didn't know you need to be thinking about? And probably the most important one, at least from my perspective, is why you should care about the last litany of P3s that have made its way onto the market and been financed and how those risk allocations were made. Why you should care. I spent a lot of time editorially explaining that point, and you have an opportunity to hear it before you even undertake on that. So without further ado, I will pass it along. I believe Chris is next.
John.
I'm sorry, John next. But thank you for your time, and I'm going to be sitting up here if that's helpful to you for further discussions.
Thank you very much. Before we get on to the next speaker, is there any burning questions by any members of our commission at this point? Again, we'll have another opportunity at the end to get into a more full-ranging conversation and discussion with all the participants here today, but I leave it to you if you have anything that you really want to address right now. No? Okay, good.
Perfect then.
Good time. You overwhelmed us. Next, in terms of the next speakers,
Paul Pedini.
okay. We've got two folks from Skanska who are here today to discuss their perspective on public-private partnership, I gather, from the private side. So I think this is a good opportunity. Paul Bedini and Chris Guthkelch. Thank you. In any event, I'll let you go in the order that works best for you and look forward to hearing what you have to offer.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, and we'll start off by giving you a little bit of background on Skanska. Both Chris and I represent Skanska. My position with Skanska is I run the civil operations for New England, and as such, I'm the individual. When you saw John's slide, it showed you the progression of the model from DB to DBFOM. I am the continuum. I represent the DB component of the P3 model, and I'll be providing a little bit of insight on what we recommend to be the key best practices for that component. And as Chris gives you some examples of past P3s, I'll chime in on what that means from a DB standpoint. But on the next slide, just give you a little bit of background on Skanska itself.
Next slide.
Yep. There it says one of the world's leading companies in the construction and project development. We are the preeminent P3 practitioner in the United States. We've had significant experience overseas as well. Chris will give you ample examples of that. We're listed as the 8th largest international contractor. We are, in fact, the 3rd largest domestic contractor, both on the building side and civil side, with over 50,000 employees. We have a strong bonding capacity of $10 billion. And we have a very diversified portfolio of work, and our 4 major business units are building construction, vertical construction, heavy civil for transportation, commercial development, and infrastructure development. The first 3 of those bullet points are the business units that we actually have here in the Boston area and in eastern New England. And infrastructure development is our concession entity, and that's Chris's bailiwick, and he will guide you through that and give you some lessons learned and examples of P3s in the U.S. by Skanska. Chris?
Thanks, Paul. So, as Paul was saying, I represent the concessionaire side of the business. There are about 37 of us, actually, in the USA, mostly headquartered in the old town Alexandria in Northern Virginia. We're entirely focused on public sector clients. And we've closed and are delivering 3 of the largest P3 transportation projects in the US. Literally, we've done this in the last 4 years. So, we're very much, eager to continue this sort of success inside the US market. We move on to the challenges and issues. And again, I won't dwell on these because you know them well. But what I would say is that time is running out to fix infrastructure. I know we all say that, but I would make the point that what you don't want to do is to be left behind as other states start to really accelerate their own sort of development programs. And I would emphasize John's point that, yes, it's great to see a good project sort of come out, but actually in terms of the market, the competition is sort of driven by looking at a state and you can see a pipeline of opportunities. So it's, those are important points to remember. Why consider a P3? Can we switch the slide, John? Again, John's provided an excellent overview of the reasons for doing P3. I would emphasize risk transfer and the whole life approach. These projects are, continue from 25 sort of plus years, but the point about it is you're operating and maintaining those assets with a guaranteed sort of performance from the assets throughout the actual sort of project itself. And in terms of benefits to the users, I would only emphasize that it's not just about sort of providing this asset. These projects do actually sort of warp the sort of universe around them in the sense that social, economic, and community benefits actually really come out of these projects, and particularly because of their long-term nature. So what makes for a good P3? I would emphasize Project Champion. It's really important for us, before we get involved in a P3 procurement, it's almost our first question. Who's the project champion? Preferably it's something like the governor, but it's certainly got to be someone who can really drive the project when inevitably it will get into sort of awkward situations, particularly during the procurement phase. We look at the procurement team itself. Have they ever done a P3 before? Are they going to be employed full-time on the project? Do they have enough capacity to be able to still take this on? And also advisors. Again, we're looking at advisors with a track record of actually advising a project all the way through the procurement process and through to the financial close. It goes without saying, you want a very clear sort of defined scope and objectives before we get involved with this. And from a Skanska point of view, and indeed I think Joe would sort of say the same, the projects, technically complex projects, are actually the right sort of thing to be looking at for going after P3s. Lots of blacktop and so on isn't necessarily the best way to employ a P3. And last but not least is the value of the project being put through the P3 process has to outweigh the cost of sort of transactions. And you'll hear different rules of thumb, but in terms of sort of size of a project and the value to be created from it by doing a P3, you're probably looking at sort of $100 million is a sort of baseline before. Below that, yes, you can do projects below that, but you have to think very carefully about how much you're actually paying to actually do all the due diligence and so on to do that project. So when not to use the P3 model, again, I think it's been sort of well rehearsed. But if you've got a situation where you've got a project 25 years plus, and it's difficult to know quite what the demand for the services being provided from the sort of the project are, again, you have to sort of think quite carefully about that. And I would only sort of make this point as a developer too, is these are businesses. We are creating businesses from these projects. It's not just the provision of the actual asset itself and the maintenance of it, but we are providing or delivering businesses which will provide for a very long-term social benefits, meeting sort of social challenges, and that's our business. Okay, move on to the challenges. Again, I think we've talked a lot about many of these challenges. I would only emphasize education. A good reason why John Parkinson and sort of Lisa here from AIAI or John from the NCPPP is it's so important to us at the earliest stage to be able to educate not just public officials and so on, but legislators and indeed the general public. And another thing we have to sort of think about is it's not helpful if in terms of the procurement process, there's a sort of emphasis on sort of short term as opposed to some of this wider strategic thinking that's required for these type of projects. And then last but not least, it's always an issue if you don't watch it carefully, and that is environmental approvals and permitting. You know, it's not a good idea to start a project procurement before you've even sort of really started to getting the environmental approvals in place. Otherwise, what happens is everything gets pushed out and delayed. So just moving on to a few case studies, and again, I'll ask Paul will sort of help me out here, particularly when we start talking about some of these sort of technical innovation that we're actually bringing to bear on these projects. But first, the Elizabeth River Tunnels, a $2 billion plus project in Hampton Roads in Southern Virginia. Capital requirement on that, $1.4 billion, a 58-year sort of contract. The success of this is that the new Midtown Tunnel has actually been delivered 6 months ahead of schedule. And, you know, the whole project, in terms of congestion busting, has been a sort of raging success. The other things I would mention here is concern is always expressed about what happens when you have a big project like this. Surely it damages the small businesses and the sort of local contractors. You know, they don't get a look in. Well, all of us know that all projects or construction projects are local, you know, in terms of delivery. And I would say out of that 1.4 billion of capex, something like 650 million is actually going to small and disadvantaged and sort of local contractors and suppliers. And the other thing I'd say here too is this is a project which Skanska is very happy and has taken toll risk. So if the traffic doesn't turn up, that's our problem, and it's our job to actually sort of manage that. In terms of lessons learned, community outreach is so critical to any of these projects. You've got to get the public on side. Stakeholder engagement, and do it jointly between the Department of Transportation and indeed the sort of concessionaire. Very, very important process. Not just during the project itself, but before it, long before it, and indeed after that project's been sort of delivered. And then, last but not least, is the importance of relationships. You know, this is all about relationships, and particularly the way in which the concessionaire, the construction sort of joint venture, and the O&M providers and so on, all come together in this sort of partnering arrangement. Soft issues are really important here. So let's move on to LaGuardia. And again, it's nice to see Joe here because he's Meridian's a partner with us on that. But, you know, LaGuardia Gateway Partners closed the LaGuardia project back in April, I guess. And that's some sort of $5 billion in terms of its size, of which something like 3.6 billion capital expenditure being required. Skanska actually teamed up with Walsh on that. But what I want to actually bring out here is to let Paul talk a little bit about the sort of just really how important things like BIM is for, you know, looking at design innovation and so on.
You want to go to the next slide?
Yeah.
And we're going to, there's an LaGuardia, go ahead. LaGuardia is a textbook example of a very complicated P3 in that we had a very limited work plate. There was the site is very congested, and we had to simultaneously demolish and rebuild the terminals while connecting them to 29 bridges in the Grand Central Parkway. So the only way to manage that kind of complexity is to the use of 4D construction sequence. This is technology that blends the Primavera, the P6 schedule to your actual CAD model. And it's done so in an interactive mode. So when we started modeling this, we broke down the entire site, both the transportation and the building, into discrete pieces that tied up to an activity in the schedule. And when you change your schedule, you automatically change the output, the animation. So it's the only way that we could wrap our arms and our minds around this estimate and accurately estimate the project. But then it's an outstanding tool to monitor progress through the job, both for the contractor and for the owner, to make sure that things are going according to Hoyle. This is technology that we have in our BIM Center of Excellence, which is actually located here in Massachusetts. And we perform this type of study on all projects, all design, build, and large P3 projects around the United States. And this is certainly something that the state of Rhode Island should not only be accepting of, but actually demand. You have to demand this type of, this level of sophistication and this kind of technology in your procurement specifications.
And then last but not least, I just want to talk a little bit about the I-4 Ultimate project in Orlando, Florida. Again, this is a widening of 21 miles of the I-4. Just looking at the sort of the amount of sort of construction required, particularly it's 140 bridges and the associated improvements for that. But all within a sort of existing sort of right of way. And so traffic management is a really critical part of these projects. And again, when you're looking at, bidders to actually, do this, the ability to really be able to deliver traffic management in very dense urban areas is a really critical sort of point. I've emphasized again the point about DBE SWAM, but I'd also like to point out the importance of things like simulators for actually being able to train up the people perhaps who haven't touched heavy construction plant before, but they have the opportunity. If they have the aptitudes to know, particularly any gamers and so on, have the ability to be able to be sort of brought into a workforce like this. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of these projects in terms of what they do to a sort of local community, both in sort of lifting up in terms of sort of direct jobs and indirect jobs, but they really force a sea change in sort of mindsets of people who suddenly realize, wow, I can get myself a really good job. And in our position, this is good investment. Our job is to continue to grow, and it's important for us to be able to know that we actually have workforces and suppliers and subcontractors that we can call on at any time as we continue to our growth. So it's important investment for us. Again, we'd like to share a little bit more on BIM.
Yes. If you want to just click through them slowly, John. This is another use of this technology, and when Chris said that it's important that P3s are clearly defined, it's equally important that there's tremendous flexibility within the design of the job, and in the participants, the bidders, are allowed to progress their designs through alternate technical concepts. We've worked in many jurisdictions, some of which are very prescriptive. They only allow certain ATCs. They may cap it at a certain number, or they may not allow any of them at all. And what the double whammy of that is that you get less innovation, you get less cost savings, and you open yourselves up to harm if those prescriptive specifications don't work. In this kind of an instance, these are, what I showed you before in the 4D model were macro views of the project. These are micro views. This is one of the intersections on the I-4 project, and we were able to, and this is a typical example of enunciating exactly what's going to happen in a specific point in time, down to the cones and the traffic signs in the street, explaining how we're going to achieve the installation of the new work, keep traffic flowing. And we use this type of an animation in our original, our one-on-one meetings with the owner, which are really critical during the design-build part of the project, the more we can come into the owner, and we've had jurisdictions where we come in and the owner would have legal experts, the traffic people, everybody in the room who are capable collectively of making a decision as to whether part of the design that we're purporting is acceptable. And what that allowed us to do is go back and incorporate those changes into our design. And this can result in, one case, we saved $100 million on an $850 million job. So the benefits to the state are immense, and it creates more innovation, and the more open and the fewer controls that are placed on that innovation process, the cheaper, the less expensive the job will be, and the faster it'll go, and it'll provide the platform for then these brilliant people to come in with the financial part of it to finish up the process. So this, you just click through it, John. But this represents one corner of a 22-mile-long project. You can imagine we've had people working on this for 2 years and will for surely years to come. But the real crux of this kind of technology is de-risking the project. Everyone here has told you risk is a prime concern. This is how you de-risk it, because you're test driving the project before you get out in the field, minimizing the options for error, and lowering the cost and making it faster. Thanks.
Thanks. Okay, John. So I just really want to finish off by reprising some of the sort of lessons learned from Skanska's point of view, from its US P3 experiences. Firstly, absolutely critical to spend time thinking and sort of planning and implementing sort of stakeholder management. And it's not just a question of, the occasional sort of public hearing. That really isn't good enough. It's really important to, have staff out on the ground and so on, really preparing the localities and cities and so on for what is actually going to be happening during the project itself. We say that, and I absolutely believe it, having been here for 10 years, but political risk is the number one risk for USA P3s. And, of course, there's upside to that too. But, for our point of view is when we're looking at, which project should we be going after, is we're thinking about, well, what happens in the event of regime change? What is that likely to do to the project? And at the bottom of this slide, it may be apocryphal, but some 50% of US P3s have either been cancelled or have been sort of delayed indefinitely, and mostly as a result of sort of changes in political will. Perhaps the wind has sort of changed in terms of, do we or do we not need it? And I would only point out things like Virginia Beach Light Rail, where, having passed a referendum a few years back, there's now been, of course, recent vote, and they've decided not to go forward, with that. And that's the reality of what we have to deal with as developers and contractors. And this stuff is really difficult. It's got fantastic benefits if you get P3s right. But the amount of planning that you have to go through, this is not straightforward Gantt chart, everything moves in a sort of linear format. This has got so many stakeholders involved with it. It is absolutely in the front of the sort of public glare that it's incredibly complex. And you have to have people who are able to sort of deal with that complexity, and be able to manage that, and be able to deal with the ambiguity and so on to get around these projects. Because the benefits are spectacular if you get it right. If you get it wrong and you just think in terms of a linear format, you're going to fail badly. And last but not least, just to make the point, it is so important to us as developers and contractors to see alternative technical concepts being put out, because it allows us to truly drive a competitive solution to to the public need. And last but not least, I just want to move on to the sort of finding the best value. You use the term a lot. And I'm saying it's more than just low cost. It's not all about the low price. It's the impact in terms of, what does this do to communities, economic development. It's all jobs, very, very important thing. But these are jobs which are not just there for the actual project itself. They continue. And more importantly is that people going through this process, having been employed on a project like this, have skill sets which are so easily deployable elsewhere. Anything else? That's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Before we move on to the next speakers, any members of the Commission have any questions or comments or anything they'd like to hear a bit more about?
Well, Chris, one of the things you mentioned, political risk, just so to clarify that, maybe Midtown Tunnel is a good example of what happened between regime changes. And maybe if you could just comment on that.
Absolutely. The Midtown Tunnel was a sort of interesting procurement in itself. That Virginia actually has P3 legislation in place which allows for, if you put a project out to competition and only one bidder comes back and says we want to do this, then there is a process that allows you to be able to sign a development agreement with that sole bidder, and then you have a sort of joint process of being able to develop the project together with the Department of Transportation and its advisors. It's a fantastic way of building long-lasting relationships, for these projects. Now, the issue about the Elizabeth River tunnels was that previously, years back, these projects have been tolled. Tolls have then been sort of taken off, and then the idea was, in order to pay for the new infrastructure and refurbish the existing infrastructure, there was a requirement to bring tolls back. And, of course, a lot of people didn't like that. But also, in order to get an affordable toll, something which could be sort of stomached by both the public and sort of local politicians, there was a decision made to actually toll that project even as we started the construction. These are sort of difficult sort of processes and so on. Now, at the time is in Richmond you had a Republican administration and a real good hard driving from sort of the governor downwards to make sure this project actually happened. Then, of course, there's a change of regime, and a lot of noise had obviously been sort of generated around the whole business about tolling existing facilities and so on. And I think that, when we look back on it, we could have done a better job both from a public sector point of view, but also from a private sector point of view to manage the stakeholders better. And so, all I'm saying is it's interesting. In fact, if it's the risk that you haven't thought about is the one, or the stakeholder or that community that you just haven't thought about is normally the one that actually comes and bites you.
Remember that when your lawyers ask you about risks that you think are peripheral. They're usually traced to something very similar to that. If I could indulge for just a footnote on that, because in a hypothetical counterfactual world here, much of what was dealing with the Elizabeth River tunnels dealt with tolling. Tolling became the strategy by which there was going to be a revenue stream to fund the infrastructure procurement under a P3. I'm not saying it could have gone another way, but there are other P3s on that spectrum, and there are other financing strategies where the tolling risk goes away. Maybe there may not even be tolling. If there's if in the assessment by that champion and in the close upfront work in the development of the project and the program, there's a, and I would have covered it if I had a little more time, my apologies. The availability payment is a strategy for P3s where you deliver, even if it's a revenue producer, maybe that you reconceive of the tunnel not as a revenue producer, and you look to other revenue sources to avoid this political risk which advances the project. It's those kinds of discussions that happen at the beginning, and it happens when you engage with the developers who say, look, Elizabeth River Tunnels, we had a tolling problem. That costs money. That's a risk for us. There's a transaction cost for us. Have we thought about it thinking it this way? So the point is, on my footnote here, is Elizabeth River Tunnels is a great example of political risk, but it's also a really good example of how you think about political risk at the beginning before you assess whether or not to go this way or that way. That's all I want to say.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
In your proposal, you indicate that 50% of all P3s are either canceled or go into indefinite delay. Is that a result of overly aggressive sales tactics, or is there some other reason for that?
I mean, it's more to do with either there may have been a sort of announcement of a program or a sort of proposal, and then thinking about it may be not such a good idea. Maybe the public has moved on. Case in point, the Virginia Beach Light Rail. I mean, you know, public were solidly behind. I think it's sort of 70% vote for light rail to be brought into Virginia Beach, and then a few years later, you know what? I think maybe we don't need this as much. So it's a change of, you know, stuff happens as people sort of adopt new ideas. But that's our job as you know, on the private sector side, is we have to figure out, you know, what are the projects which are definitely going to make it all the way through and actually sort of deliver a great sort of benefit at the end. And I think we expect it as it's just a necessary part of the process, that these are such big problems that that the public sector has to, you know, to sort of figure out that sometimes probably the best decision made is to just let that project drift out sort of indefinitely, or actually physically cancel the procurement. But a lot of the time, there's political sort of will behind whether these things happen or not.
Was it because structuring the project is just so complex that by the time you get it done, the political climate's changed?
Not in my opinion. Sometimes, but a lot of the time is people want to roll something out before it hasn't been completely thought through.
Right.
And frankly, the political aspirations of some, you know, this is really good for my district, hasn't worked it out internally. That's the job of the champion that we keep talking about before. If you get that vetted in advance, you diminish that political risk. And I'm glad you said that, Chris, because political risk is, you've confirmed it is the largest impediment in the engagement of the private sector. But in my opinion, as an attorney, it's mitigatable. You can spend a lot, it's not completely, you can't remove it entirely, but you can do a lot of homework. Don't go running off fancy pieces of paper with pictures of fancy bridges until you've sorted out your revenue streams, until you've sorted out the right time to roll the project out, until you know whether or not, if any particular risk that would be reserved to the public sector could actually be covered. Whether or not the people that you are going to be tasking with running this program and into the project actually know how to answer those questions. And I think that goes back to your point where you say when you come in and you're vetting a project, whether or not to engage, you're looking for a champion, political climate, advisors, and the training of the people who are involved. So I think 50% go sideways, in my opinion, because 50% of the people don't know what they don't know.
I have just one comment to offer. I mean, in my experience in dealing with public projects, my bet is that 50% of most public projects are either deferred, indefinitely delayed, canceled. Yeah, at least that's my experience. I've been in Rhode Island long enough to see that it happen. Or they'll change form in some way, perhaps come back years later. I mean, I've worked on projects personally that haven't gone from the conceptual stage and the discussion stage to the back burner, back on the front burner for a period of time, and it can be 10 years or more before the project actually gets into the ground and is done either as a conventional procurement or as a as a public-private partnership type procurement.
And one thing the private sector loves to do is to come in very early indeed in the process and be able to actually engage with the sort of agencies and their advisors and actually bounce ideas.
Exactly.
It's important to us, we can understand where the project is in terms of its life, but we can save a lot of tears later on. And so it really is it's an important part of the process. If we find that an agency is keen to engage, that's a very significant tick in the box for going after a project.
One comment I'd make is that in the beginning, some states they had a change, say, in governor, and they went from pro PPP to kind of anti, and the new guy ran anti, and killed a major project. Well, these private companies are spending millions to pursue and invest in doing PPP in that state, and it ruins that state's opportunity to attract interest from the private sector for a long, long time. So, I mean, I think that's a lesson for Rhode Island. If we're going to start this, one of these, we need to finish them, and we need to consider the political risks for political winds that change. But no, thanks.
Yeah, the worst thing can happen, really, in terms of the procurement process, is that you get all the way down to a stage where you've selected the preferred bidder, so a lot of money's been spent to get there, and then suddenly, maybe we should actually refer this to the legislators for a sort of final sort of view, and that makes certainly the private sector very nervous indeed when that happens.
Thank you very much.
If I could.
Anybody else?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You indicated in the discussion so far that there's the 3P concept fits best when there's technical complexity. Is that also saying there's a minimum value, minimum dollar value that needs to be involved to be able to really attract interest from qualified players?
I've got to let Paul actually sort of respond to that. I would say that I sort of threw out 100 million as being a sort of floor that you might want to sort of to think, if it's, schools and things like that can be delivered clearly for much less, but then to get the full benefits of something like that, and some social infrastructure, you would be trying to bundle the schools together into something a bit bigger as a program. But perhaps
I think we need to distinguish between transportation projects and private commercial projects. I know that there's consideration locally for a commercial model where it's more, it's different from the dynamics of transportation.
The other thing is I would add is that, as I think you'll hear implied, if nothing else, is this whole market is literally learning, as it goes along. People are standing on the shoulders of others and so on, just to advance this thing along. So there's some truly innovative thinking which is going on inside the market in terms of being able to bundle risks, in terms of being able to sort of see are the ways in which you can bring sort of commercial real estate sort of thinking into some of the sort of P3s. That's the beauty about P3, and particularly as it stands in the States. As John sort of showed earlier, you've got this continuum of risk, and it's just a question of figuring out where's the right place to actually sort of take that risk. I think I would also say is for those who get worried, and I know that's not the case here, but for those who worry about if P3 is going to take over the world of government sort of procurement, even at its best, where I came from in the UK, I think no more than 10%, if that, of all government procurement was actually done as P3.
I think we all have some additional questions, but let's get to the last group of speakers representing the Association for the Improvement of American Infrastructure. We have Joseph Aiello, Chair of Fiscal and Management Control Board at MBTA, and John Parkinson, Executive Director of AIAI. I'll let you speak as in the order, and sequence that you prefer.
Thank you. We're actually
Supposed to avoid this in
Right,
P3s, I thought.
that's one of those symbols we want to try and avoid at all costs. What we thought we might do is take a couple of minutes to share the perspective of someone who has experienced a lot of the exposure to risk and had an opportunity to introduce some of those innovative and creative solutions to some of those challenges, and in fact has faced head-on, abruptly perhaps better put, some of the political risk issues that have that have been brought to bear in recent enough transactions that they're very real world. As Joe will get ready to speak, I wanted to chime in a quick point that John and Chris were just talking to about, about the 50%, P3s canceled and otherwise. If you look at it from the right lens, you can certainly make those numbers work. Projects that might be considered as a candidate for a public-private partnership, certainly you would include in that. And so when a decision is made along the procurement path, and we'll talk a little bit more about that and emphasize some of the points that John had raised earlier, those all count in that metric. So if you've gotten to a point that you've decided it's not in the best interest of the public to pursue this as an alternative delivery method, that would count in the metric there of the 50%, that will have been canceled. Don't want to scare anybody into thinking there's a fiscal close, a financial close, a commercial close, and there's shovels in the dirt, and now the P3s start getting canceled at that rate. I just wanted to clarify that so as to avoid that misperception, because, Mr. Coffey, I think along the lines of what you said, all procurements are subject to that across a broad range of sectors. P3s are not unique to that. That's why it's so important, and you'll hear this emphasized again shortly, the old adage of best to measure twice, cut once. Carpenters have been living by that for a very long time, and it's critical in this environment because the stakes are so high, because the rewards are so high, but invariably the risks are there, and there's a lot of hand-holding, not hand-wringing, on addressing those risks, and that's why P3s make so much sense. So just wanted to raise that point. And on the transition topic of risk, if we ask a AIAI member, Joe Aiello and Meridian, to address that and your perspective from the public sector as well.
Sure. So I'm formally here as a partner at Meridian Infrastructure. We raise a series of private equity funds to invest in public infrastructure. I'm happy to talk about my work at the MBTA, but that's not particularly why I'm here. I might follow up on a couple of topics here with respect to risk, and I think there were perhaps a few points I might want to emphasize from my colleagues here. One is certainly the role of legislative bodies. And I think if you were to look around the country and determine best practices, it's important for legislative bodies to weigh in and set the regulations and set the tone and set the standards about what will make an acceptable PPP. But it is fairly deadly if you want to look at cancellations. It's a fairly deadly disease when the legislative body is allowed to approve the deal at the back end. And it's really something, not that legislative bodies inherently are evil people, right? They're not, but they have changed people. So while you have a governor that typically has 4 years, and in the first year of that governor's term, they begin a procurement process. These procurement processes typically last around 3 years. It's quite frequent that every 2 years you have a different set of folks chairing a variety of committees in the legislative houses, and so you have completely different folks there that didn't know the deal in the first place and may have a pretty wildly different view. So I think in terms of best practices, what we observe is the need for the legislature to weigh in on the law, to weigh in on the promulgation of regulations, and to pre-approve other criteria in advance at which projects need to demonstrate that they meet that criteria, but try to avoid a legislative blessing at the back end. The other lesson, I think, in terms of failure, and then I'll explain sort of who Meridian is, but I thought I'd just jump in given the time, is the use of P3 is not an excuse for the government to walk away from its obligation to protect the public interest, right? And that's another thing that we see when projects fail. Oh, I've got a P3, let's just give it to some private enterprise. You live, and we all live, in a political world with multiple complicated stakeholder groups, with complicated regulatory and financial environments. And I think Chris said it, communicating with them about how you're doing this project as if it was a normal project is still the best practice obligation of the government. That should not be transferred onto the private sector. I think John was talking about even the fine-grained issue of tolling. You may decide to toll a facility so you can raise some revenue, but you can make a second separate decision to say, we, the government, want to retain the collection of the tolls and the toll risk because of a variety of reasons, which may be that despite your best efforts of communicating and showing documentation to the contrary, the public just doesn't trust having the tolls in the hands of the private sector, whether it's privacy concerns or concerns about the ability to sneak in rate increases that nobody can figure out. None of those are true, by the way. But so there are a whole series of fine-grained decisions that you all need to make, and frequently when we see these projects bubble up and hiccup, or whatever term you want to use, is because there has been an abdication of the public sector's responsibility in other jurisdictions. So just a couple of cautions. Just a bit about Meridian, and then I really will be very brief here. We're about a 12-year-old firm. We are a private equity firm that came into the market with a very different view about public-private partnerships, and that is that we decided we wanted our limited partners, who are typically public pension funds, insurance companies. We have the Lumberjacks of British Columbia Pension Fund as an example in our funds. We wanted to have them be aligned with the long-term interests of our government counterparties and the long-lived nature of the assets. So we came into the market asking our limited partners to be in for 25 years. So it's a radically different approach because it allows us to say, and I'm not just talking about Meridian anymore, I think the entire private equity world that operates in this business, to be able to say to you, the counterparty, we're going to be here today at the beginning while we are making our proposal, but we're going to be here at the back end when it's time to turn the facility back to you. So that, I think, is a very different change in the market that has been than what has been in existence prior to sort of 10 years ago. Paul Padini showed you that terrific graphic. I'm going to jump around just a little bit and skip some of my other remarks about the LaGuardia terminal. It's important to note the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey did an extraordinary job of building the case for why people should come and invest in that very large, complicated project in a very difficult town to do work with an authority that had a sort of a legacy of doing things a bit odd. They spent a great deal of time on it. They got great competition. The end result that came really from the Skanska team was marvelous. New York Port Authority had spent 20 years trying to figure out how to replace the central terminal. They had hired the best planners, designers, architects to come up with a variety of schemes. In fact, I wrote it down, they had paid for 27 different schemes over that period of time. The technical solution, which was driven by you must keep all the gates in operation, you must keep the traffic moving, and you've got to build back something that meets operating costs, construction costs, competitive features that they built into the deal, and it's something where we are going to take market risk on the ability to sell retail goods to the customers in there, as well as some of the passenger employment fees. We came back with a schematic that nobody had thought about. And the only reason we really came with that schematic is because we were driven to compete with two other international organizations, right? And if we hadn't, it wasn't that our architects were any smarter, but you put the architects and the contractor and the operator and the financer in the same room, and you say, gee, there's two other teams trying to outthink us, it really provides enormous value to the client. Can point to other projects, the Elizabeth River Crossing, Port of Miami Tunnel. The government thought it was going to be a $1.2 billion rock construction project. 2 to 3 bidders. We were the successful bidder on that. Came in at under $700 million because they were allowed to innovate. They had a broad set of environmental restrictions about tunneling under Biscayne Bay, but that the technical firms were allowed to think about meeting the goals of where the tunnel would come up on either end, but a little bit of guidance to be able to innovate about how that tunnel was going to be developed, and it developed enormous cost savings. Can't overemphasize the obligation to communicate. It's across the board. There's a phrase that I think could be applied to other things, but change with uncertainty is deadly, right? Change everybody thinks is a great thing, but we don't explain what the change is going to be. It allows people to think about what that change represents for them. They're always going to come to the worst conclusions. And you're going to think about small businesses, small contractors, middle-sized contractors, local engineers, architects, suppliers, your public workforce. What does it mean for me? Have I given up, and is the public thinking, am I giving up control of these assets to the private sector? If done right, and John will tell you, a PPP gives the public and the taxpayer greater control over short and long-term private sector performance than in a traditional procurement. And the reason is the leverage over the fact that I have my money in the deal and Skanska has their money in the deal, and if we don't perform day after day for the next 35 years, you don't pay us or you penalize us, right? There's no other kind of procurement arrangement between the public sector and the private sector that gives you that kind of leverage, and so therefore something to consider. The last is, this is not a one-size-fits-all business. PPP will not be the answer to all of your dreams and expectations. It will have limited application to your projects, as Chris described. But it is an important tool, and if used for selective projects, can really provide great outcomes for customers and great outcomes for taxpayers. I'll go to John.
Great. Thank you, Joe. So as we're going through a little bit of the fundamentals of P3s, you'll see in the slide deck provided to you a little summary of a lot of what has been talked about across a range, both from a legal perspective and the practical implementation. And so I think it's important to be able to highlight a little bit about what a P3 is, and I think each of the speakers thus far has talked through that. It's important to understand that a P3 is not appropriate for every project. I think the 10 to 15% metric that Chris shared, and Joe, his description just now, really highlighting that it's important to understand when you're applying the right tool for the right reason. It's not simply a matter of going out there and finding, this can work. I wasn't able to do it before, so let me try this way instead. That's a big part of what the pre-screening process is really all about, and understanding what the needs are, the outcomes, the anticipated outcomes, the expected performance at the end of the design and construction phase, and getting to that operations and maintenance phase is a big part of that, and communication and transparency are the underlying components of that. It's equally as important to highlight what a P3 is not. Most importantly is the early slide that John shared in terms of the structure. One of the fence poles there, is about privatization. The most important thing to reemphasize about what a P3 provides is public sector control. It's all about the public interest. If we're talking about building something that shouldn't be built because it doesn't address a legitimate need that wouldn't rise to a level of priority to get a responsible government agency to make a decision, to commit the resources, time and money, then the private sector is not really all that interested in it either, because that's going to be more subjected to the political forces, to the changes in priorities down the road. It's the adage about about deferred maintenance. If you defer it long enough, it becomes a capital replacement program. That's not what a P3 is designed to address. It's designed to be able to address this in as responsible a way as possible. And so it's important to understand, that component about privatization, that control issue that Joe just mentioned. And then the other piece is, beyond it not being privatization, it's also not a source of funding. It's a common misperception that, when you talk about, here, I don't have enough money to build this project, so let's do a P3. That's not what this is about. And I'd be remiss if I didn't, highlight that as a point of emphasis, because it really does, the notion of if we don't have the money for this, if we've not identified, a pay-as-you-go, strategy, it doesn't have the ability to generate the revenue to allow you to offset the cost it would take to design it, to build it, and then downstream, to be able to operate it and maintain it. Can't identify those, the source of funds to do that, then you wonder whether it's a high enough priority compared to the other things that you're having to take on. And so that's a big part of that. So we talked quickly about the benefits of P3s, and there are lots of them. But the slide here that is designed to capture some of the attributes that are used to describe these could be used to measure or to evaluate any procurement method, quite frankly. But we highlight these as components of the benefits of public-private partnerships, and these are indeed the attributes that we use to evaluate best practices for procurement methods for a legislative framework going forward. And I'll talk about that here in just a moment. But the idea is to be able to convey what the value proposition of this procurement is. You're trying to get to to that end goal of meeting a public need, and to doing that in the most responsible way in the public interest. And these are the attributes that we look to highlight, as specific to public-private partnerships. So a quick thought here about the assets. You saw a slide similar to this before, but one of the charters we understand about the commission is to evaluate what the eligibility for or the applicability of different product types, to use a real estate term, or to the different infrastructure sectors, so that this is not just, for the last couple of days at AASHTO, this is not just roads, bridges, and tunnels to toll or not to toll. Right? There's a lot more to public infrastructure, and the sectors that are identified here, the 9 categories of them, and 3 examples of each of those, are designed to help broaden the perspective. And I think this goes back to an early point that John made, and that is, if you're designing a program, you should design it with something other than this 12-mile stretch or this 21.4-mile widening and capacity expansion in mind. It really ought to be with the broader infrastructure needs of the state of Rhode Island, taken into consideration. And if it's a procurement tool in the toolbox, drawing on that metaphor again, it could be applied to something other than just a road, bridge, or a tunnel, as has been the case, as a broad category. There's lots of other ways to do that. We have examples of social infrastructure across the country where that has been successfully applied, and we think that's something that ought to be considered as from our perspective, it's a best practice to allow that. Whether or not that hammer, that procurement tool or method, gets applied to an aggregation of schools, a number of schools that might be modernized, or to a water treatment, a group of water treatment facilities, whether that's the case or not, isn't as material as you've got the flexibility to do that. So when the circumstance presents itself, you've established a forward-thinking framework to allow that. This does get around to the notion of, once you've seen one P3, you've seen one P3. A number of our board of directors members who have said that in the past, and it really does strike at the notion of understanding how best to approach the whole procurement process and the framework that you're operating within. It's easy to describe as the slide conveys, a typical P3 process, but when you get right down to it, the difference between approaching this as a revenue risk, transportation, heavy civil project is going to be a little bit different than a people-centered, transit-oriented development opportunity that's really about a foundation for other other revenue sources, other tax revenue that may come from real estate development around a station for a mass transit, stop as an example, or the retail opportunities available through a modernized central terminal building at a previously thought of as a third world airport, at least as it had been described sort of infamously or famously. The idea is to build upon that and see what other opportunities there are. So again, once you've seen one P3, you've seen one P3. It takes a lot of time to work your way through it and to think it through in the process. And that's why we commend you for having this commission to understand what those possibilities will be, because no one wants to be sold a procurement method for a particular project. You want to be able to establish a framework that will allow you to work your way through that. This is where I go back to the adage I referred to earlier. The carpenter famously better to measure twice and cut once. The failed projects, how long a project's overdue or how far over budget it is for the people who tend to have approached it in the past with the other dynamic in mind. Even some of the projects that you have here in town, there's big signs that tell you where you are in terms of schedule discipline and budget certainty. That's a level of transparency and communication from the public to the public sector to the end user that's not typical, but is a welcome step. You've already got some of the seeds planted that will allow P3s to work in Rhode Island. I referred to this a little bit earlier. One of the ways that we've come across, I think each of you have a copy of the best practices guide, and this matches up nicely with the information that I know, the evaluations that have taken place through the National Council for Public-Private Partnerships and with the Association for the Improvement of American Infrastructure. A number of other entities around the globe have contributed their thoughts on what best practices are. We approach this and the recommendations that are made by AIAI in testimony like this, as well as other educational opportunities, are drawn from what other people have gone through before. In some cases, they've suffered through them. In some cases, they've helped them identify new, creative, innovative ways to get through a project. So our best practices are based on our best practices recommendations are based on an analytic framework that takes into consideration the other states that have P3 enabling legislation, those that have practiced and procured projects through that, because not all those that have P3 authority have exercised that authority. And that's drawn from more than just the U.S. We started out by looking to our neighbor to the north and evaluating some of what they've been able to do. I know that law firms have done that. The legal advisors, technical and financial advisors have also engaged, in that, and they have experience in both. And so we've drawn upon that, both global best practices, North American, and specifically, through Infrastructure Ontario, through partnerships, BC, British Columbia, and that's been a big part of helping to inform the process. And then the practical experience of our member companies and those who aren't member companies but are leaders in the industry or practitioners of public-private partnerships. And it's important for us at least to be able to identify that. A couple of quick notes on some of the resources that are available to you, and I know NCCCP has some of these available as well. And it's important to know that there are resources out there, not only for the Commission, but also for legislators. In all the excitement of last Tuesday, one of the important things for us to note, the one policy issue that got addressed, in the victory or acceptance speech by President-elect Trump, was infrastructure. One of the things that's exciting for us to understand in the context of the slide that you see here is that there are 7 new senators coming into the upper chamber of Congress. There are 55 new members of the House of Representatives. A little uncertain just yet what their understanding of the policy framework that will contribute to how to execute on the vision or the plans for investment in public infrastructure. That's one of the reasons why we draw upon educational resources, our partners at NCPPP, our member companies, and elsewhere, to be able to help share, what some of that will be. And so that's one of the examples, at the federal level, so too with each state as you newly enable public-private partnerships as a procurement method. We look to offer, program, it's direct education. It's a P3 direct program, as you see here. There's workshops, there's roundtables, there's lots of opportunity to go and hear from others what they've experienced or suffered through, depending on their perspective, so as to know how best to prepare and establish a framework that will make for the best possible outcome going forward when you indeed engage in that. And we draw members of AIAI into that, and these, as often as not, the Public-Private Partnership Conference, which is an annual event, as many public sector entities are represented there, and public officials are in attendance there. They're there to learn. They're there to share their experiences and best practices with their colleagues, and it's all part of the communications process. I think we've all hit on communication as a fundamental ingredient, going forward, and I think it's critical to be able to do that. So, I'll close with that and let you know that, again, we applaud the notion of the Commission looking into what makes sense, what works, what are the best practices going forward, so as to position Rhode Island to be the best stewards of the public investments in infrastructure going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank each of you speakers and the organizations you're here representing very much for accommodating us and making yourselves available to us. Again, I know you've given us quite more than a baseline of information with respect to P3s. Let me give you something back with respect to Rhode Island's experience in P3s, and there are others on this panel who can elucidate on their own experience. But Rhode Island has really been doing P3s for the better part of 20 years, if not longer, based largely on some very thin legislative authorization with some creative thinking to fill in some of the details that you'd otherwise might expect in legislation. I gather, my question is, I gather from your discussion is that you prefer to work in communities or states that have some kind of comprehensive legislative structure that kind of provides the roadmap, standards, everything else that's necessary to support a P3 and potentially the financing of a P3. Is that, am I characterizing your sentiments fairly well?
Short answer is yes. The protection of the legacy that you're looking to create is a big part of that. You're establishing a framework that will allow you to be able to pass that, the legislature, the ability to pass on that same authority. The predictability in the marketplace, I think, is an important part of it. When you think about how much it costs to bid a project and the competition that you're talking about, you want to stimulate the best and the brightest so that you can get those competitive proposals. If the thinner the legislative authority, the less protection there is. It's almost a matter of how much of a safety net you want, and so that's the longer end of the short answer was yes.
I mean, I'd only add one more, which is obviously having sort of robust legislation in place is absolutely sort of required. But it's what goes on after that in terms of the procurement guidelines, because again, each of the potentials of bidders is actually going to say, okay, so how fair, transparent, objective and so on is this procurement going to be? So it's important to actually, if you're showing will, it's one of those sort of key indicators that said they've got legislation in place, that's great. Now, is this being turned into procurement guidelines, which is telling us there's something coming down the track?
And if I could add to that, the long-term dimension of this, the transparency and the competitiveness of going out into the market and getting your appropriate partner, we have to live in this community for the next 40-odd years. If it's viewed that we got here inappropriately, we've got 40 years of people who are going to nick us to death. right? So we'd rather, collectively, we'd rather not win a project where it wasn't clear, how did those guys show up, right? We wanted to be a really tough competition, real clear sense of evaluation criteria that then says, these are the folks that met the challenge laid out by the government best. Because that's in our interest for you to provide that for us.
Again, I want to leave opportunity for others to ask questions as well, but obviously we do that in the RFP and the other procurement documents. We'll provide that level of detail. Is that sufficient for you, even with a thin layer of legislative authority? You like that?
Robust legislation, absolutely, you have to start with that.
I can characterize ours as, I can boil it down to about 5 words. We can alternatively procure projects such as the ones we've been talking about based on the lowest evaluated bid price, which is in the best interest of the procuring authority. We've stuffed a lot into the term evaluated. Again, based on that, we have developed these RFP documents.
I'll defer to John.
I appreciate the nimbleness that you've managed to exhibit in making those P3 projects work through Rhode Island, but I can assure you that if you have laid out in bright sunlight, chapter and verse with lots of cross-references that have been checked exactly how things are going to play out, that quite frankly will reflect your reflection on the parade of horribles that are possible in a procurement process, that if these folks, and I'm speaking for you for the first time in my legal career, that these folks are going to have in mind, they're going to be like, well, what happens if, and then they go, oh, they thought about it. That's going to increase the number of folks that play, and that brings
it's all about confidence level. I'll make one other. I work on the public side as well, as does John, and what I like to tell my so-called adversaries on the other side of the table is say, we need to sit on the same side of the table. I need to understand as much about your needs as limitations as you do about mine, and that's the way we're going to go about this procurement and the negotiation. I'm sorry, did I interrupt you?
I was just going to say, sounds like you're a P3 lawyer.
Another issue that often comes up with respect to privatization is that does this open the door for only large companies now to come in and work in Rhode Island, bringing in, to the detriment of the local economy, workforce, companies. I have my own experience with that. I don't want to answer for you, so I'd like to hear how you engage and how you turn what these are very expensive public works projects into hopefully economic development projects with some real local impact.
The absolute only practical way, only a fool would approach a P3 in a jurisdiction, a new jurisdiction, without rounding his team out with his or her team out with local contractors and local businesses. You have to have that local element in the process, both to keep touch with your the political forces behind the project, keep touch of marketplaces, ensure labor tranquility, make sure that your partner contractors have a sense that they're part of the problem or part of the new project and not a victim of that. And that's absolutely been our mantra all around the country, and it certainly will be the case here, as well as the other competitors, I'm sure.
And that's also true during the operating period.
Yes. Yeah.
I'll just footnote on this again on the public side, but my observation from very particular, real, practical procurement situations that I've encountered, I've watched someone say, not only for these extremely valuable reasons, but if I pull someone from here to here, I have the transportation costs, the housing costs, the difference in, and those are costs that make their bids less competitive. So I'm not going to go. I'm going to go almost as far as to say, not only is it foolish for the reasons you stated, but it doesn't make economic sense.
And that's actually one of the driving factors behind a number of high-profile P3s. Joe mentioned the Port Miami Tunnel, the direct, indirect, and induced job creation from that, well north of 75%. Construction's a local sport, right? There are no virtual excavators going on beyond the modeling, as depicted earlier. But at the end of the day, that bulldozer's moving, Rhode Island dirt. And it takes somebody sitting in that seat to make that happen. And as you often find at a job site, there's a number of companies' logos on the back of that, and they're the companies who participate in that special purpose entity in the design build joint venture. It's not unusual to see that more than, this is the company I came from, jacket. It's the safety vest that represents the whole team, and it's important to be able to highlight that.
Yeah, I might also add that it also includes participation in the equity group that gets arranged to compete on the deal. I can give you a number of examples. One is the Dallas Police and Fire Pension Fund system is an investor in the local toll roads around the Dallas metropolitan area. So we very much encourage those kinds of things. It's the right thing to do for the community. It's also the smart business for our side of that.
And if I could just add one quick point on, when we did an analysis of the companion bills that were presented in the last session here in Rhode Island, it talks specifically to transportation. That is one of the recommendations. A best practices recommendation is that there, if you'll pardon the expression, a made in Rhode Island clause that could be introduced that would allow for local hiring to. And it's not always just a stipulation of a certain number. But it oftentimes, and to your point about can you just capture this in the procurement documentation? If you make part of the evaluation criteria for how you're going to judge one proposal, compared to another, how much local hiring is there. It's less about demanding a physical presence in the state as it is commanding a local presence that has the real economic benefit to it, the direct, indirect, and induced job growth. And that's a big part of that. You think about projects like the Rapid Bridge Replacement Program in Pennsylvania. That was one of the evaluation criteria that made the difference on a razor thin margin in differentiating bids. That was a big part of that razor thin margin.
Excuse me.
Oh, I'm sorry. John,
Doesn't that run afoul of federal highway regulations?
I was going to say something about that. That's
It does.
part of the there's local hiring preferences are tricky depending upon how it is that you intend to think about how you're going to finance your project. So, but I'm going to use that. You're right. Your intuitions are spot on. So, yeah, you have to decide how your revenue stream is going to drive your selection criteria, which is part of the front end work that when you roll out your project to the private sector, you're very forthcoming with that. Hey guys, this is a federalized deal. I can't do a Rhode Island, you need to hire Rhode Island people. That may not play well with the local folks, but that may be one thing that you counterweight with other things if you want to deliver the project. I'm going to venture to guess that being forthcoming with that information is useful to you as you form whether or not to bid and when you do bid, just to come right out with it.
John? I'm sorry.
One of the issues we're going to have coming down the road is really this process, the education process to the public as to how the public understands what we're trying to do and why. Because again, this is different. Does either NCPP or AIAI do you do any kind of local workshops? Do you do anything like that? As I recall, you used to, I think.
We work together. I would like to say that I'm wearing my NCPPP hat. The answer is yes. And frankly, that's where Sean and I actually got to rekindle our relationship not too long ago. NCPPP runs boot camps. They're intended to be fairly intimate affairs, and everything that I gave you in 20 minutes would be about an hour, and there'd be about 4 other hours worth of information that talks through procurements and negotiations and so forth. But yes, that is something that NCPPP offers. That is one facet of, I think, what would be a very appropriate 3-dimensional strategy on education. And I know for a fact that AIAI brings perspective that NCPPP doesn't, the benefit of which is that you get a 3-dimensional view about the P3s. We give groundwork. That's kind of our market share. AIAI has other things to add, so I'll kick it over to you.
And that is very much a part of the offering, is to the audience who's assembled oftentimes will dictate what the level of intensity of the messaging is, and sometimes it's, Skanska has a very nicely produced 4-minute video that wraps up the entire summary of everything you need to know about P3s in 4 minutes of an animated sketch. That's one element of it, and it really helps to convey to people who don't have a deeper appreciation. By the time you get through a boot camp, NCPPP style, sit down with a round table, kind of a format that AIAI has produced in a number of states around the country, in a number of markets, you get to really, dig in pretty deep on what some of the questions are. And as often as not, it helps, from the public perspective, refine some of the questions so that you can ask better questions. I mean, we literally at the last P3 conference, we had, north of 150 people for 2 hours, and the whole format of the discussion were P3 questions, P3 answers. And that's literally one of our offerings, and you just put them out there in any way you can.
I was going to say, the third leg of the stool is they bring me in for a very dull, monotonous 47-minute explanation of what Skanska does in less than 4 minutes, which puts people to sleep. Can be helpful. So.
Thank you. John Simmons?
Yeah, let me just first start in the sense of being a partner that Sean had mentioned, since you'd be a partner to the public side. You've suggested to the public side that they should be clear in their mission, vision, et cetera, and what they want from the project itself. Now, tell me what I'm assuming you're not doing this for a philanthropic purpose, that there is some rate of return to the companies. What is the rates of return, not specific percentages, but where do you make your money, and what are the risk factors that we would limit or impede your ability to make the money that makes it profitable for you to do the projects?
Terrific question. The first best line of defense is to have a great legislation, great regulation, and a great set of projects and build competition, right? Because the more competitive we are, each one of us is a price center. There's the design, construction, operations, maintenance, and the equity returns and the financial structure. The more competitive it is, the tighter all that stuff is going to be. Probably the biggest challenge you're going to face with respect to cost premium are going to be those folks who say, hey, I can borrow today a 30-year bond at 4%. Why am I paying an average cost of capital? Let's assume you have a TIFIA private activity bond mix and a 10% tranche of equity. You might have a 200 basis point average cost of capital increase on that. That's true. It's important to think about, though, the cost to the taxpayer over the life cycle of a project. So think about the design, the construction, the operation, maintenance, the life cycle improvement, and the cost of borrowing. The capital cost, the cost of borrowing on average is likely to be, depending upon the complexity of the project, less than 7% of the total cost stack of that life cycle of costs that the taxpayer is going to experience. There will be a little premium on that line because our cost of capital is greater. But if we're innovating, if we're coming with a LaGuardia solution that nobody had thought about that gets it built faster and for less money, if we're coming in $400 million under the estimate of what a traditional contractor would have come in under the Port of Miami tunnel project, we wipe out that premium in efficiency gains in a second. And that's what you've got to think about as you're constructing it, to make sure that your really protective measure needs to be not on the cost of capital, but your cost of all-in exposure to the taxpayer, and can we provide you a greater value? And that's why you need, frankly, the outside experts to help you model that and think that through prior to launching a bid, and make the business case to your constituents prior to, and say, look, we could do it for this amount under normal circumstances on a life cycle basis. Here's the history of doing these things in Rhode Island. And then throw a challenge to the private sector and to say, we have no business in awarding this if you can't come in 7-8% beneath that. Then think what happens. Then you've got 3 finalists, 4 finalists who are all saying, I got to be under that bogey or they're not going to award the project. But I've also got to be the lowest of the four teams. And so frequently, that's where the innovation comes in, right? You're driving people to rethink it. This alternative technical concept that was responded to can drive that value. But
Can I ask you a question, then the others? So therefore, you should, or we, as a public entity, should understand what our cost structure might be, the life cycle cost, et cetera, and then say to you, okay, here's what we think it might be, and your presentation would be is we can do it for lesser. We're smarter, better, whatever you want to use it, or this is what we do for a living, whatever the term is. And that's a process that you would have.
And that really does get right to the, earlier John had mentioned the value for money, analysis. The flip side of that, the public sector comparator, is part of that evaluation phase that, to really lay out all of the cost, not just the first shovel in the dirt cost, or the cost through the lifting of the gate, to make that asset operational, but over the life cycle. And understanding that full range of costs is really what helps for an apples-to-apples comparison.
Mr. Bernardo has a question, if we could move on.
As a follow-up to the cost savings, is there any correlation between successful projects that go out with just a base technical concept and allow for as much ATC as possible?
Let me pop on that. Generally, no, and this is a procurement thing. This is where I'm on the public side and these guys aren't. If you let absolutely every ATC in, then you cease to have a procurement that they can trust is an apples-to-apples comparison when you come down the pike with who you pick. So and it actually plays into a bit to what you say. This is part of the partnership formation discussions at the beginning is a lot of in-procurement one-on-one discussions where they give us feedback. We come out and we say, look, it's got to be the same or better, and we need 6 because we're only staffed up to deal with 6 ATCs. As a unit, all of the people who are in a procurement might come and say, look, hey, this thing's really crazy. You need to at least allow 10. And then you go back and you think, okay, is 10 going to put it to the point where I am unable to fairly evaluate and open ourselves up to people saying that we're not, we're lifting the veil, Lady Justice? That's the discussion. That's the partnership up front. That is having your act together in advance of going to them. So not a universe of them, but you would be foolish to say you only get one ATC and then not listen to what the private sector says. That would be an example of pushing a risk that doesn't give them an opportunity to innovate, and then the distance between what you could get it on your own and what they can deliver it is maybe 0. That's not what you would do a P3 to do.
Yeah, what I was trying to get at is you want that sweet spot where you get the LaGuardia advantage. You get, they tell you, listen, I want to maintain the terminal, I want to maintain traffic, but you're not telling them, I want 10 penny nails, I want,
Yeah.
You tell me how to do it better, quicker, cheaper, and deliver.
There's many of these projects, at least the ones I've been involved with, are done on the kind of the 10, 15, 20% level in terms of conceptual design, maybe a little bit more. So you're having people bid. You're looking for bids that are apples to apples, proposals that are apples to apples. I should put it that way. But you can also request alternatives. Innovative alternatives that are maybe to the benefit of the proposer, but also to the benefit of the municipality, of the state government agency, and that save money, that are more durable, that meet a whole host of other goals that the agency might have. And, that can be the difference in one of these procurements as well.
We've had instances in the past where we come in with really aggressive ATCs, creative ATCs, and when we're allowed to, when they're accepted,
Yep.
we go back and we discover, hey, now I can look at this condition now exists on the job. It gives birth to yet another ATC. We've actually had third-generation ATCs that end up being really substantial because the ownership team has everybody in the room. They make a decision which you can incorporate into your design, and you have enough time left, and time is a critical component of this, that you can go back and further ideate. And to us, from my experience, technical one-on-one meetings, I agree there's an upper limit, but there's absolutely, if you do too few, it's very much detrimental to the process. But commercial one-on-one meetings for us that's where we physically sit down and negotiate the risk and the quantity and the the value of that risk, and whether the owner can then say, I'm going to retain that, and that's going to be my cost, or I'm going to put that back on the contractors and run with it. So both of those, we've been in instances where we've had 6 of both, of each, and in one instance we were allowed 58 ATCs on the job. So it sounds like an absurd number, but it was actually very, very constructive. We were able to make major changes, and we actually affected the cost of the project significantly. It was manageable.
Town Administrator-elect Izovsky would like to ask a question.
Well, two questions, please. One, just help in terms, you've mentioned robust legislation and regulation. I don't know if each of you could offer us recommendations, not tonight, but just documents that you think that we should read, not necessarily a copy, but that we should read before we make advocacy for our own. And second, you talk about a pipeline, assessing a pipeline, and looking at your LaGuardia project, your Norfolk project. We're not New York City, we're not Miami, we're not even Eastern Virginia. We're 1 million people. I don't know if we've yet issued a $1 billion single agreement. I don't think we have as a state. So do we have enough in the way of opportunity to really create an interest in 3P projects based on the threshold?
I think social infrastructure could be a series of schools, I think Chris described, that accumulate to 100 million or up CapEx value. That's certainly kinds of projects we've done before. Collection of wastewater treatment plants that might add up to the total. Again, we have seen a bunch of bundling of sort of more smaller scale projects to get to that 100 and up $1 million threshold. Those are absolutely possible.
Yeah, I mean, I would add that we start from the point of view, what are the issues and the challenges that the state or the city or the sort of locality is actually sort of trying to deal with? And is it all about the sort of horribly complex social challenges? And that's where we start from in terms of saying, is this actually going to create an opportunity? Every time I look at risk and look at mitigation of risk, I think of the opportunity that actually gets unlocked in some mitigating it. So it's very, very important for us to have these very early sort of discussions, being able to, to come in and sort of meet with officials and so on. So we truly understand what is it that you guys are sort of struggling with, and more importantly, what is the really key sort of priority that needs to be sorted out. That's where P3 and this opportunity to be able to come in and sort of discuss is so important.
Chris had mentioned earlier that statute's good, and then the guidelines about how you move through a P3 process. In many states, guidelines is an unsolicited proposal process where folks, thinking this through says, have you thought about this? And it may be that the pipeline is built by people who are interested in Rhode Island. And you would need an infrastructure, no pun intended, in place to be able to deal with them, vet them in a fair way, and then to be frank, to be transparent to the private sector, people who float it to you, how those will be handled. But I can tell you right now, Washington, D.C. is in its infancy on that itself. And a centerpiece of that in Washington, which is also a reasonably small geographic location, is a lot of projects that have come from unsolicited proposals to the district. And so the opportunity is there not only for you to think about what you need, but it's for other people to say, here's what we think you need. Have you thought about
it? And that really gets to the to the notion of, sometimes it's an ideation session that leads to another thought down the road, so getting to hear at some of the educational forum that are, have been created, to hear what others have done, and across a broad range of size of communities, counties and municipalities, both. It's not just the It's not just the mega, the mega projects. I remember when the Goethals Bridge was first announced. In New York, it was a massive project, and at the time, it was great news for the 3 people in the audience of 540 people who heard that, because they were the successful bidder. And everyone else looked around and go, well, it's too bad there's not more by state agencies with multi-billion-dollar resource commitments to a bridge that works out that way. But indeed, the discussions around how creative that procurement mechanism turned out to be, it fits into the design, build, finance, maintain model, and it got other people thinking. And so a number of procurements have been issued where the revenue risk component of that, the toll taking and the toll setting, the fare schedule, is all maintained by the state entity, and it was brought about by the big mega project, but applied in a very different way. And then to your first question, if we may, I think, John, we both are in a position to be able to say, yes, there's lots to read that we can make available. Some of it is outlined in the best practices guide that I think you each have a copy of now. And then there's model legislation, there's language, and there's recommendations around each of those provisions. And I would certainly count that as amongst the educational resources that we'd be happy to provide and to share.
Go right ahead.
On one of the Skanska slides, it said that it would make Rhode Island more attractive to business. How?
Where we start? I mean, back to the sort of infrastructure, and particularly sort of transportation infrastructure, the ability to be able to move your goods, move your people around and so on more easily, has got to be an upside for economic sort of development. I mean, I think about things like if you look at Southampton Roads and Port of Virginia, or you look at the sort of maintenance issues you get on sort of highways around Virginia and so on, but the impact on businesses of actually sort of not being able to either renew the infrastructure or be able to expand it does make a big difference.
Go ahead.
When you're working on a transportation toll-funded project at a long-term basis, how do you hedge your risk against a municipality or a legislative body saying no further toll increases? Well, how do you, I mean, I just don't understand how you get that secured for 25 years.
Yeah, well, I was going to say.
Don't be
That would have been my answer.
Well, you had indicated earlier that you find acceptable subject to annual appropriations, I gather, by municipal or...
Well, I don't want to smoke out my colleagues at the table, but my guess is they spend a lot of time thinking long and hard about what the actual risk of non-appropriations is going to be before they play into the game. And to be frank, sir, no further tolling. They're going to model that, and then they're going to find out if it's a go no go, and they get.
No, I'm not saying no further tolling, but the fact that you don't control the tolls is a legislative body controlling the toll rates, and it's an unknown for you.
But what the best practice is around the world on this topic is to have a contracted arrangement for toll increases based upon some index.
Consumer price index or something.
Yeah, so it might be 50% of the increase in the regional consumer price index, but you can only do it when you get to multiples of 25 cents or something like that. That provides certainty. The notion that you go before a regulatory commission on a regular basis would be difficult to achieve this good outcome.
I have, John, did you have another question? No. I have one last question in terms of your experience with cost comparison, savings as opposed to design, bid, build on the kinds of projects that you've been involved with. I've got my own experience in terms of what municipalities might save on water, wastewater, particularly over the life cycle. And it's significant, some startlingly significant, which obviously frees up other available funds for other projects, other uses, other programs. What's your experience? Have you been able to? I'm sure you've calculated that.
I mean, I don't have the figures with me, but they are actually well obtainable because there have been a whole bunch of studies done, maybe not so much in the US, but certainly Australia, the UK, Canada, and of course a bunch of more academic sort of studies really trying to get underneath this. But it is I think I was looking at something aside from the actual delivery of a project within the timelines, but in terms of being able to look at a public sector comparator and what's the capex on that, what's the cost of operating over a certain amount of time. Again, given the opportunity to have ATCs, given the competition that sits around this, you can 15% or better those are the sort of savings you can look at in terms of your capital alone. And then in terms of particularly for a DBFOM, is the SPV, the special purpose vehicle of sort of running the operations and maintenance, it is literally incentivized. It has to maintain, the very, very efficient sort of costing and so on as it drives the project forward.
And so I think 15% is about what academic and other studies have pointed to life cycle cost savings on it. I might want to point out to something that if you hired someone like John to absolutely croak people like us, one of the things to be clear about is that we're going to continue to innovate over the life cycle of that property or that building, whatever it is, to try to make it be more efficient, to try to drive more earnings. Best practices are you retain a majority of the increase of that upside, right? That's in the document. So we've got an ability to try to squeeze an extra dollar out of it while meeting every single one of your standards that you've created, if we can. You typically get 30 cents on the dollar. He'll make it 70 cents on the dollar by the time he's done. But seriously, it is always, the incentive is always for us to do better, but you do even better than us on any upside that might derive from it.
Well, I think we'll be a partner.
Yeah, I've got one public client that swears that their life cycle cost savings as compared to design it, they bid it, somebody else builds it, goes back to that municipality to operate it, versus the design, build, operate, maintain, is 35%. So I don't know if John can top that, but we'll continue to compete, won't we? You're a guest. I know you're being polite. Listen, again, I want to thank you all very much. To give you some sense of, this was very helpful. I think it gave us all a much broader perspective with respect to P3s. I mean, we certainly have our own experience, but even me, my perspective has been broadened as a result of this discussion, and I think I've had a good deal of experience over my career. In terms of where we're going from here, we haven't made a decision as yet whether we're going to propose legislation or not, or whether we're going to propose specific legislation that may fill some of the gaps, such as protection of unsolicited proposals. But, we've heard what you've said. I have my own feelings about it, but we'll have discussions as a group. Our next session, which we alert the members, we hope to schedule first or second week of December, maybe on a Tuesday night. I'm having trouble with Wednesdays all of a sudden, which were free up until now. But we'll get back to you with respect to the scheduling. We'll focus on a presentation by Matt Fair, who I think some of you know from my firm based in Boston, on the current authority that exists in Rhode Island law for P3s. Again, my 5-word phrase, and others in the regulatory world as well. Both on the municipal level and the state level, we'll take a look at some of the independent governmental agencies that are involved as well to see what their authority is. We'll have that discussion. We're also intend to invite in representatives of the various state and local authorities that are involved in projects that may be amenable to P3s. Find out if they've had experience with P3s, what their experience is, what they think the benefits or limitations are of the current legislative and framework for authority. So we'll invite them in, and we'll essentially see what their needs are as well, where they'd like to go with P3s if they'd like to proceed. So that'll be in, again, early part of December. We'll take a break over the holidays. The legislature will be coming back soon enough. We'll consult with them with respect to, and among ourselves as well, with respect to the direction, and hopefully have more concrete approach to announce come January. Okay? But again, thank you very much. I know on relatively short notice. I'm glad if you can stick around a little longer, you can add to our economy. That would be great. Other than that, thank you all so much.
Thank you.
I think we're adjourned if there's nothing else. Okay, motion to adjourn. Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Thank you.